There we go. So this is a very special Silicon Valley Green Team Network event for us. So thank you for joining us. We're very excited for today. Before we begin, I just wanted to highlight that we are offering ASL services for this event. And our two interpreters' names are Jewel and Christina, and they are from Interpreter Now. So I did send an email out to all registrants with a tutorial for those of you that do need ASL services for our event today. But essentially, if you do need ASL services, please make sure that you pin the interpreters on your screen. Now we have two, and they are going to be rotating between each speaker. So make sure that you pin the other interpreter as we switch to the next speaker for the event. And if you do not need ASL services, please make sure you leave your webcam deactivated. This makes it easier for those that do need the services because they can hide non-video participants. So again, if you are not speaking, please keep your webcam off for now, and you can turn it back on when we have the breakout session later today. So bear with me, I am using two computers at once. I'm going to launch my PowerPoint slide now. Let me get this going. Okay, hopefully everyone is able to see that. If you lost track of the interpreters, just remember that you can change your view in the Zoom application. So who am I? My name is Robbie Brown. I am the Community Engagement Associate for Acterra. And joining me today is also Nicole Angel, Patty Christopherson, Samantha Haslam, and Amanda Johnston. Acterra is an environmental nonprofit based in the Bay Area. And to be more specific, we are located within Palo Alto. We have been around for 50 years now, and we are driven by environmental problems that are occurring locally and globally, but primarily the problems that have resulted due to climate change. We engage with our local communities, companies, and agencies in the Bay Area. And typically we focus on Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. However, that is changing quite a bit, especially with this virtual reality. So we are covering more areas within the Bay Area now, and we are very excited about that. The Silicon Valley Green Team Network is part of our workplace sustainability program. So our Silicon Valley Green Team Network is for representatives and volunteers from organizations who are interested in increasing sustainability in their workplace. We also offer a free membership for anyone that is interested. Samantha will be posting the link to our webpage in the chat box below. About halfway through the page, you can find the registration form. If you do become a member of our network, you get access to our LinkedIn group, ability to network with other like-minded professionals, and we also have a vendor list and a database with resources. Next, I would like to highlight our sponsor, LinkedIn. Thank you for your continued support of our program and our events. And before we begin, I just want to highlight some upcoming Acterra events. So on the 14th of October, we have Vegan Nutrition, What Does the Science Say? With Jack Norris. He's a registered dietitian and executive director of Vegan Outreach. This is on October 14th. On October 18th, we have a free Drive Electric workshop. This will cover the benefits of being an electric car owner and reveal the many incentives and financial perks that make EVs cheaper than gas-powered vehicles. On the 21st of October, we have a virtual coffee hour with Acterra's executive director, Lauren Weston. These are very fun and somewhat informal events where you can have one-on-one conversations with her and guests. And then on the 29th of October, Acterra's young professionals are having their third event, Exploring the Career World, covering standard approaches in career growth, featuring Curtis Cox of Curtis Careers. He's going to be covering topics such as knowing your pace in the workplace, self-assessments, work etiquette, networking skills, and so forth. So our event today, Expanding Inclusion in the Environmental Space, will feature two keynote speakers. We have Parwana Ayub, the Environmental Equity Policy Fellow from the Greenlining Institute in Oakland, and Diedre Tanenberg from, she is a Public Affairs Assistant Coordinator at San Francisco Department of Environment. After our keynote speakers' presentations, we will have a short Q&A session before we go into breakout rooms. Any questions that you may have for our speakers can be submitted in the chat box. This is a Zoom meeting, not a Zoom webinar, so there is no Q&A tab. So please submit your questions in the chat box for us. Our Q&A portion is only 15 minutes long, so I cannot guarantee that we will get to everyone's questions, but we certainly will try our best. Again, just beyond thankful and excited that both of you are interested and willing to present today about this topic. I'm very eager to learn about both of your experiences and from your presentations. This has always been a relevant and important topic, but I think now more than ever, as the effects of climate change are becoming more obvious, more and more individuals are noticing these inequities that have existed in communities that are under-resourced or typically not included in the environmental space. There are communities that have and continue to face disproportionate burdens from air pollution, for instance, sea level rise, food apartheids, and even exposure to COVID-19, just to highlight some. So with the intersectionality between environmentalism and social justice issues, climate change solutions have to involve all communities, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, the deaf community, those that are hard of hearing, and so forth. So I'm now going to step away from the spotlight and hand it off to Parwana. Parwana, let me get your presentation ready.
Thanks, Robbie. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Parwana Ayub, and I'm an Environmental Equity Policy Fellow at the Greenlining Institute. I just would like to thank Acterra for inviting me, and to thank Diedre for joining me here, and everyone else for joining us and making time with everything else going on in the world. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll refer to it as DEI interchangeably through the course of the time. Namely, I'm going to explain what DEI is as separate but related concepts, why it's important in the green sustainability spaces that we all work or interact with, and then finally, how you can advance DEI in your work, wherever that may fall in the green sustainability fields. So, but first, let me explain who the Greenlining Institute is. Next slide, please. The Greenlining Institute is a racial and economic justice public policy organization based in Oakland. Greenlining is actually a made-up word, but it comes from the term redlining, which was the explicit and systemic government-sanctioned practice of excluding communities of color from federal investments and economic opportunities. So, as you can see on my slide, the map on the left is a redlining map of the East Bay from the 1930s. Areas that are marked in red were places where predominantly people of color lived, particularly Black communities. And those areas were considered credit risks because of the presence of people of color and were marked off limits for federal investments. Although redlining is illegal today, the impacts from decades of underinvestment due to redlining in low-income communities of color still linger. And we can see these impacts in the form of high poverty rates, high levels of pollution, lack of good job opportunities, high energy costs, and so much more. The image on the right is a current day CalEnviroscreen map of the same area. The CalEnviroscreen map was created by a state agency here to identify California communities that are most affected by sources of pollution and socioeconomic conditions. Areas in red on the CalEnviroscreen map are areas that suffer from the worst pollution and are most socioeconomically disadvantaged today. So if you compare the two maps, you'll see that the red and orange communities on the right that suffer from the most poverty and pollution are also the same communities that were redlined over 80 years ago. So at the Greenlining Institute, we work to overcome the negative impacts of redlining. We greenline communities by actively bringing in economic opportunities and investments into these communities across all of our work. And one of the issues we work on in the environmental equity team is to make the clean energy economy diverse, equitable, and inclusive so that everyone can have access to the environmental and health benefits that come with it. Next slide, please. But what does it mean to create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive clean energy future? Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion are separate but very related concepts. The terms get thrown around a lot today, but people don't always know how to distinguish between them. So I'm going to be defining the terms. Next slide, please. Diversity is about the who, namely who has a seat at the table and who doesn't. Diversity acknowledges that we all come to the table with varied sets of experiences, identities, and characteristics. In general, these differences can be grouped into 3 categories. Demographics include things like race, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, physical resources. Experiential includes things like economic or social position, education, occupation, faith, abilities, dependence, and caring responsibilities. And then finally, cognitive includes how we approach problems and how we think through issues. Inclusion, on the other hand, is concerned with the how. Inclusion focuses on the practices, policies, and processes that welcome and embrace a diverse workforce. So inclusive workplaces are companies or workplaces where any individual from any group is welcomed, respected, and more importantly, is able to fully participate. So an inclusive work and welcoming workplace culture embraces differences. And a workplace could be diverse, but not necessarily inclusive. So for example, places where they have diverse employees only in entry-level positions might seem diverse at first glance, but if you look at the hierarchy of leadership, it becomes more white and more male. The lack of diversity across leadership in any workplace might be an indication that they're perhaps not very inclusive because not everyone has the ability or opportunities to advance in leadership positions. Equity, finally, is concerned with justice and fairness. Equity acknowledges that we all start from different places in life and that some groups require additional support or resources so that we can all reach similar outcomes. At Greenlining, we define equity as the redistribution of power and resources in order to identify and eliminate systemic barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So, for example, Block Power is a Brooklyn-based clean energy startup that analyzes, finances, and installs energy efficiency, renewable technologies, and buildings in low-income communities. So buildings in underserved communities present more challenges because of their age and initial construction style. And due to a dearth of investments and resources, the problems are compounded by years of foregoing repairs and improvements. And so Block Power's equity-centered mission and business model are helping low-income communities access the financial, social, and environmental benefits of clean energy technologies. Next slide, please. So why does DEI matter in environmental sustainability spaces? Well, right now we're in the middle of a global pandemic, an economic recession, and an uprising to reckon with racial injustices in this country. And the present moment serves as a great reminder that the race-based inequities we see today across all sectors of society didn't happen by accident. These inequities are the result of decades of structural racism woven into the fabric of our political, social, and economic systems and institutions. The policy and practices of redlining I provided earlier is just one example of this. But more importantly, in the context of climate change and the fossil fuel-based economy in which we all live, communities of color and low-income communities have shouldered most of the burden while receiving little of the benefits. So today, low-income communities of color are more likely to live next to coal-fired power plants, refineries, and other polluting facilities. Collectively, this disproportionate exposure to pollution leads to higher levels of things like asthma, cancer, and other pollution-related health impacts. So, that COVID-19, which is a respiratory stressor, is disproportionately impacting the health and livelihoods of Black and Latinx communities first and worst. And furthermore, future climate threats like wildfires and extreme heat events stand to worsen the unequal health and economic impacts that communities of color are already experiencing, and they have the fewest resources to cope with future climate threats. Next slide, please. But so why should it matter to all of you? Why does it matter to all of you, or why should it matter to all of you? Well, you're all leaders in creating a sustainable and clean energy economy and future, and you have the power to make sure that it's also equitable. The transition out of fossil fuels and into renewables is inevitable, but if we're not intentional about centering equity, diversity, and inclusion, it'll be easy for things to fall into business as usual, which will continue to perpetuate environmental injustices we see currently. So as we transition to a clean energy economy and clean energy future, we have to ensure it's a just transition, one that centers equity, racial, and social justice. Next slide, please. So now that we've looked at what DEI is and why it's important, let's shift our focus to what you can do about it. How can you implement DEI in your workplace, wherever that may be? So the recommendations I'm about to provide are designed to be foundational practices for workplaces that don't have a lot of resources or are perhaps new to this work, but nevertheless, they're important steps you can take to advance DEI in your workplace. Next slide, please. So the first set of strategies I'm calling internal strategies. And when I say internal, I mean strategies that focus on diversity and inclusion practices, policies, and processes inside the workplace concerning employee and employer well-being. And they fall into 4 categories. The first set of strategies is around workplace culture. Work towards creating a more inclusive and equitable workplace culture. Each company needs someone to build culture, set boundaries and expectations of behavior. Communicate your DEI goals with your staff clearly and make sure that people follow them. You can start this by making a strong commitment or pledge to DEI, for example, on your website, and then educating the rest of your staff on why this is important. Another small step you can take towards making this commitment real is to encourage and support initiatives that promote DEI. So start with 1 to 2 initiatives. For example, a lot of companies have affinity groups or employee resource groups for connecting underrepresented groups with their within their companies so that they can build relationships and feel less alone. For example, most large corporations will have a group for women identifying individuals. These are typically voluntary, but are seen as core part of diversity and inclusion initiatives. The second set of recommendations is around hiring. So once you've started the foundation of a culture of inclusion, make sure that you hire and maintain diverse staff. Use a broad range of recruiting resources to begin with. Underrepresented employees can come from non-traditional sources, including things like vocational training programs, community colleges. Target these type of settings to attract talent who otherwise might not see your job posting. The second set of strategies around job descriptions. Be careful how you write your job descriptions. Minimize references or perks that might appeal only to young male white applicants in the job pages. Things like company retreats in exotic locales or sporting outings, and rather emphasize inclusivity in the job post. Eliminate conscious and unconscious bias in resume evaluation. Research has shown that unconscious bias creeps in when we look at resumes of potential candidates. You can use technology to remove personally identifiable information such as names, zip codes. And then finally, use an inclusive interview process. Use structured interviews, asking the same standard questions. Use flexible, open-ended questions that permit more than one type of answer. The third set of recommendations is around compensation and promotion. Make sure you have clear processes and systems that promote fair and transparent compensation and promotion. Compensation disparity between underrepresented groups and their white male colleagues is a very prevalent issue. And the first step to compensating fairly is understanding that underrepresented groups, including people of color and women, are often underleveled, not only at their current job, but also when they change jobs. So hiring underrepresented groups at a lower level than their previous job is a red flag. And then finally, you all know this, but compensation encompasses more than just salary and should include things like parental leave, bereavement leave, etc. The final set of internal strategies is around training programs. Establish diversity and inclusion training programs for all of your employees. You probably need to bring someone from the outside who's an expert if you can afford to. Workplaces must devote time and resources to training to teach employees on how to be inclusive, what the norms are, and how to handle problems when they arise. The trainings should be ongoing, proactive, and specific because learning about DEI is a continuous journey, and this belief should really guide your training initiatives. And importantly, the training shouldn't only be for middle management. Senior managers and executives must be trained as well to show that diversity and inclusion are a priority and that those in leadership are taking it seriously. And then ideally, training should focus on specific approaches to working in an environment with diverse teams. Topics could include things like performance review, communication, feedback, unconscious and conscious bias, and so much more. But working through specific issues can help to make the trainings more effective because employees understand the real world application of ideas and values and are more engaged with training. Next slide, please. The next set of recommendations are external, and external strategies here focus on the external social impact you could have with your services or products that can help create equitable outcomes for underserved communities. And by design, external strategies are more applicable for companies, organizations, or workplaces that are in the business of creating services, benefits, or products for the general public. So these recommendations also fall into 4 buckets. The first is around forming community partnerships. Work on forming partnerships with communities and which will lead to more diverse demographic of funders, employees, and customers. Partnering with community-based organization is a great way to learn how your services or products could continue to be improved with community considerations, allowing for your product to fit market needs in a targeted way and thus improving the market demand for your product or service. Some examples of how you could start forming these community relationships is you could attend community meetings, you could attend city hall meetings, attend conferences, just spread information about your presence in the community, especially if you're new there. The second set of recommendations is around choosing your investors or your funders. So for a lot of nonprofit groups or early stage startups, clean tech, clean energy startups that are always seeking more funding, as you seek more funding and develop relationships with funders and investors, make sure that you communicate your DEI commitments with them and ask them about theirs in return. There's been a recent shift in public and private funders starting to require social impact as a criteria for funding. So for example, the Kapor Capital venture, so for instance, Kapor Capital, which is the venture capital investment arm of the Kapor Center for Social Impact based in Oakland, has started to invest exclusively in companies that not only have potential for financial returns, but also have potential for large scale social impact. They have an initiative called the Founders Commitment, which aims to incentivize startups to include diversity and inclusion in their companies from day one. You can take a look at their website for more information on this. The next set of recommendations is around building inclusion in your products or services. So if you are in the business of creating and marketing products and services, there's a responsibility to create products that reflect the needs of all users, no matter who they are or where they live. And in order to really do this, you need to have a diversity of backgrounds, voices, and perspectives in your staff to begin with. It's more efficient and effective if you build inclusion in your product from the start. So think about and review your target audience. Does it include underrepresented groups? If not, what are you going to do about it? And for those of you involved in the early stages of service or product or program design, think about your prototypes or pilot projects. Do they represent a diverse pool of potential users? It's so much easier to think about this stuff in the early stages rather than in the end when it feels like you're trying to fit square pegs into round holes. And then lastly, be careful of how you market your products or services. Ask yourself if the chosen methods will reach groups that usually are underrepresented. And then lastly, don't contribute to displacement as you grow. So we're all aware here in the Bay Area that the relationship between Silicon Valley's tech industry and economic inequality is complex. In general, tech is one of the state's biggest growth industries, but it comes at a price. And the price is that all of the economic gain goes only to certain groups or communities or individuals. So when this kind of development or economic gain is tied to income, what happens is it creates increases in price of things like real estate or just cost of living, which in turn leads to higher income folks wanting to live in those neighborhoods more and more. So when this kind of development, tech-driven development is tied to income, what we see a result, and we have been seeing in the Bay Area, is that blue-collar workers, retired folks on limited income, or low-income folks in general that have called the place home are slowly pushed out and can't afford to pay rent, property tax, or the cost of living there anymore. So for a growing economy driven in part by the tech industry to benefit more people and to lift communities that need it the most, we have to find solutions to this problem. And that's why I included this as a strategy. But this is a really complex issue. So what can you do about it in your capacity? Well, the first step is to think about what the issues are in your community when it comes to social issues and general quality of life. Suggestions of ways you can do that is, again, attend city hall meetings, subscribe to newsletters and blogs of community-based groups that are working on solutions. One aspect of an equitable growth plan would be to make sure you strike a balance of hiring locally and folks from the outside. Maybe you could create programs that train decent high school grads through internships or volunteering, or you can focus on hiring local vendors to supply lunches or cleaning services. And then another option is to get involved in local government and civic projects. So for example, you could use staff retreat and training as opportunities to volunteer and form relationships with key groups and leaders in the community. Once your presence in community ties and resources grow, consider getting involved at a higher level to influence local and regional policy around social issues. So consider joining the board of nonprofits that are working towards solutions. The overall idea here is to leverage your position of power and influence to shift systems level change through policies and practices, so that the economic gains you're helping to create is dispersed equitably at the local level. And so that concludes my recommendations. Next slide, please. What I want to say as key takeaway is that keep in mind that DEI implementation is a long-term commitment. You won't see results overnight, but the good news is that you're committed to advancing DEI in your workplace in a way that makes sense for you. And addressing DEI issues requires us to understand the root causes of the disparities we're seeing today, which is why I spent so much time talking about historical context. So, and right now across so many industries, we see leaders, employees, funders struggling with seeing any lasting impact when it comes to advancing DEI issues, despite how much money they throw at it. And I think part of the reason for that is because DEI has mostly been treated as something where you check the box once or do because it's nice to have and creates good publicity. At the Greenlining Institute, experience has taught us that DEI values must be integrated into all parts of a program, policy, company, or initiative in order to achieve the most equitable outcomes. Thank you, everyone. I will be in the discussion rooms to answer questions, and we also have a Q&A at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a valuable presentation. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder, please submit your questions in the chat box if you have any for Parwana. And you can also privately message me, Nicole, or Patty Christopherson if you're feeling shy and don't want it to be visible to everyone else. Next is Diedre from the San Francisco Department of the Environment. She's going to be talking about her experiences and her recommendations as well. Let's hand it off to you now, please.
Thank you, Robbie, for inviting me here today. I know there are some of you who work with me at San Francisco Department of the Environment. You're used to working with me when I speak with you and when I interact with you, but today I'm going to use sign language because that is my comfort zone. I want to let you all know, I'd like to share some background about myself. I was born to a hearing family, and I was the only deaf person in my family and the only signer. I had some exposure to deaf culture, but I was often the only deaf person at my school, or there may be other deaf and hard of hearing students at the school at some points, but I was raised mainly using sign language interpreters. That experience led me to advocate for myself, advocate for resources and tools, and that became one of my strengths, especially leading me into my environmental career. So I want to thank Parwana for your wonderful explanation of DEI and the importance of understanding that. As I share my journey with you, to talk about how I've led to speaking with you today, there are some organizers in the community, people who would like to be part of the environmental community, but they don't know how to get in. They do not know how to ask for accommodations in this space. So I went to college and I was mainstreamed. I went to Rochester Institute for Technology in New York, and there were over 2,000 deaf students there. That's the first time I identified myself as a deaf person and found my home among other deaf students. At that time, I was thinking about psychology or sociology or social work, and that was not offered at RIT, and so I moved to Portland University. There was a very small deaf community, and I was there for a while and then moved down to Southern California. And again, I didn't find my community until I moved to Sonoma County. And that's where I found my niche. I found the people I connected with, very like-minded people who wanted to work in public health and support the deaf community and support the environment. So that's where I worked as a residential counselor for at-risk youth. And I became a national resource management staff person at Santa Rosa Junior College. I learned about recycling, compost, waste management, and when I went back to the residential facility I was working at, I taught my children the children there what I was learning. We all learned how to recycle or to compost, and they would keep each other accountable. When I saw that, I realized this information was not accessible in the deaf community. The deaf community in the Bay Area was not very familiar about solid waste and recycling and waste management. So that is when I dove in and I changed my mission. I changed from social work and psychology and moved into environmental studies. I joined outdoor leadership program, and I was involved with community education, leading workshops and education related to climate change. I took classes at Sonoma State University and graduated after 2 short years. After my first semester, I launched a successful compost pilot program. for the residential dining hall there at Sonoma State University. I worked with the student body government, the campus representatives, and then off campus, I worked with the organizations to make sure that we worked together to develop this pilot program. At the end of the semester, it was extremely successful. That was my internship, which led to a paid internship and an amazing opportunity. I was then selected to serve on a local task force on solid waste, which really led me into the world of solid waste. After graduation, it was very hard to find a job in this field. I looked all over, but as a deaf person, often people did not know what to do with me. So I started to network. I attended conferences and different events. I would show up at meet and greets, trying to meet people in the industry to convince them to give me a chance so I can prove to them I could do the job. I started working for 2 different consulting companies, waste characterization studies. And the second organization was a research-based organization that looked for programs and policies and education related to solid waste. While I worked with these 2 organizations, I was not hired as a full-time person because they still questioned how I can be successful in that field. I then worked for REI, Recreational Equipment Incorporated. Many of you are probably very familiar with REI. And it's a very good company, and their mission is aligned with mine. They believe in living in the outdoors. That is a way of life, and a life well lived. I'm always wondering how to get deaf people out into the beautiful outdoors. I would bring them into the store, and then I was so thrilled to have the opportunity to lead outdoor classes, hiking classes, and it was very successful. In order to convince deaf people to join me in the outdoors, it continued to be a challenge. Even though I would say, come join me, I'll sign for you. A lot of people did not know about it. They did not know about REI, or there were different language background, cultural identities, and they did not understand what it meant to be outdoors. So so now we'll talk about where I am today. I'm at the San Francisco Department of the Environment, and they hired me to join the Environment Now outreach team. We're responsible for grassroots outreach. And we speak with residences, businesses, multifamily residences to talk to people about how to properly sort their trash. I enjoy these conversations. I do presentations, I work at tables, at events, to help people understand what goes where. Many people still do not understand. And I'm trying to unpack, where is this missing information? Often it's language-based. This information is not available in their language. So again, it brings me back to the deaf community. Is this material available in sign language? So I continue to work on this effort. We have a wonderful, diverse grassroots team. And one thing I love working at this department is their values. They value equity, collaboration, credibility, impact, and innovation. These values mean that I'm valued. I live those values as well. And I live those values in and outside of work. So that is my journey, and that's how I'm standing in front of you today as the public affairs assistant working on policy with zero waste. And I have the opportunity to talk to policymakers about the policies they establish, to think about how it impacts zero waste and all of the communities involved. Often policies do not consider people with disabilities. And so there are many cultural identities, many marginalized identities that need to be considered on the policy level. So this department took a racial equity steering committee, established a steering committee to discuss how to make sure that we are continuing to be inclusive, our policies are inclusive, and who is not sitting at the table. I always want to be at the table. I always want to be there to listen, to learn from them, to learn from the industry experts and the policymakers. As I want to understand these policies to see how they apply to my community. And I know many of you feel the same way. This information is important for your community and to apply to others. So I'd like to share some helpful hints, things for you to consider, and how to apply DEI to your organizations. First of all, I'd like to reiterate Parwana's PowerPoint related to DEI. I found one cool acronym that helps me understand. You know the show Pimp My Ride on MTV? Some of you are probably familiar with this TV show. The analogy, diversity, is the outside work, the body work. Those people who have positions of power and influence, you have the opportunity to interact to those that do not have access to information. Use your role, your leadership, your influence to interact with people who are external to your organization. Now, the inside of the car or your organization, that is inclusion. You're focusing on the feeling of belonging and the power to address inequity and address needs for socially marginalized groups. Offer them a seat at the table. Listen to their thoughts, their concerns, their experiences. That's an important part of inclusion. Again, going back to the car, it's the inside of the car. Now, the last part, equity. Equity is the engine. What does it look like on the inside? What is working? What is not working? It's important to take a look so you understand how you can reshape. You know, you want a car that looks good, feels good, and sounds good, and that is equity. With that in mind, I would like to share my 3 A's. The first A is attitude. Part of equity is to look inward and look at your attitude. Recognize the bias that you have related to a person with a disability, a person who uses sign language, or who has different identities that may be different from yours. I have a very quick short story I'd like to share with you of what happened to me only a week ago. I wanted to attend a virtual online event. I asked for interpreters ahead of time, but they did not know how. They did not know how to respond. They did not know what to do. They suggested, can't you just use captioning? Won't that work? They were asking me to do well enough because they did not have a financial, a line in their budget for sign language interpreters. That makes me hesitant to ask for what I really need because of their attitude. I decided not to become involved. That is a barrier. And so if I could plant a seed with you all to see if you are open to the possibility of creating a pool of money to address interpreters, the needs of interpreters that other organizations can tap into. Organizations may be able to receive some funds from this pool, and not only and then the person who has received those funds may be able to report back to the organizations who contribute and share what they've learned. So you have an opportunity to interact with a person with a disability. So they are contributing to your organization as well. Now the second A is ask. I appreciate Robbie's approach with me. He simply asked me, how can I provide access? Which interpreters do you prefer? Which agency do you prefer? I appreciate him asking what I prefer, because of course I'm going to recommend qualified, highly qualified interpreters as they are from Interpreter Now, to make sure they know the context, and they meet the requirements to understand how to interpret in this field. Interpreters are not simply, facilitators, they're storytellers. They're able to understand the big picture and then translate it into another language. There are some signs that are still being developed. Sustainable environments is a relatively new industry. And there are students at the Rochester Institute for the Deaf who are actually coming out with these terms in sign language. I just learned about them a month ago. So I myself are learning the signs in our own industry, which is a great sign that this industry is becoming more inclusive. So back to interpreters, we want to make sure the interpreters are familiar and are qualified to provide accommodations in whichever event they're asking for. So this really helps me with engage and have a very stimulating conversation. Now my third A is accommodation. As I mentioned before, a lot of people are hesitant to ask for accommodations. Maybe the organization is a nonprofit, they don't have funds, or, but if the first two A's are met, the attitude and the ask, we can find ways to accommodate. There's a variety of ways to accommodate. I myself have tremendous privilege. I can speak, I can read lips, and I can sign. But that does not mean that you take away my need for access. We can't assume accommodations. That's why asking is so incredibly important. Each person needs to be asked. There are deaf people with a variety of needs and accommodations. There are deaf-blind people. There are deaf people with additional disabilities. So it's important to ask the individual. And when we open this dialogue and bring more people to the table, this space can benefit from their innovation and their contribution, and that I'm so thrilled to be involved in this work, in this space. Thank you all for listening to my story and allowing me to share my journey. Parwana, thank you so much for your information. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so glad both of you were available today to participate in this event. So thankful. So now we are going to move to the Q&A portion of this event. Again, it's fairly short, roughly 15 minutes. After this, we are going to go into breakout rooms. So let's start with the questions that I have. Diedre, the first one is for you. If someone does say, "What's wrong with just captions?" how do you explain?
Actually, that's a good question. So just having captions, the first part of that is not all captioners are reliable. If there's no backup to the captioning device, you're relying on a computer that can do a good job most of the time relaying and transcribing the information, but sometimes there's technical errors or glitches. Sometimes it doesn't understand or pick up the right words. Maybe accents can cause issues. So a lot of times captions are really simply no good. Another thing is I read all day long, and I don't think I want to spend my time reading any more than I have to. To be honest, that's my own personal feeling on it. But I do appreciate when captions are available. Most definitely, I appreciate it. It's better than nothing, but it's just that. It's better than nothing, but there's great room for improvement.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have one more question for you. What are some examples of initiatives and actions your past and current employers have taken to make the workplace more inclusive for you and other people with disabilities?
Great question. Yeah, when it comes to SFE specifically, when I was hired here, we created a best practices guide for communication, and we outlined a list. And so I came up with the list with different scenarios, possible scenarios. So for example, in group settings, you would have an interpreter, whether remote, VRI, video remote interpreting, or an in-person interpreter, and we described how placement should look, where the interpreter would stand within the room, or if a presenter was coming to speak, to make sure that the lighting was appropriate, that he took his time, spoke slowly enough, he or she, so that the interpreter could keep up with the presenter. Those types of tips. So if you want a template or a guide as far as what best communications practices are, ask the very person who's needing those accommodations. And you never know, there could be other people in the office that will also benefit from having this type of resource list. So it's not just on one person, but really it's beneficial to others and all as well.
Thank you so much. Parwana, this next one is for you. And they ask, are there any resources you can share for training staff on DEI?
Yeah, so the Greenlining Institute is, if you go browse their website, one of the things I think Greenlining does well is research and putting the research into frameworks that can then be used by external groups on how to operationalize equity. So one thing I wanted to share, my supervisor, Sona, she researched and published a framework on how to operationalize equity. And I see a question in the chat that about that saying, well, how do we operationalize these concepts at the grassroots local level? So that's one resource you can go. I think it's called Making Equity Real in Climate Resilience or Climate Planning, something like that. And then we have various different frameworks for different specific areas. So there's an excellent framework on how to operationalize equity in transportation, for example. That's another great resource on our website. But that I think I would point you to our website. Yeah, for sure.
Great. And just to kind of add on to that question you were mentioning, so they ask who typically owns this issue? to them. It seems like it's a function that falls within HR, product design, maybe even communications and finance.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so they said many of these functions seem to fall within HR, product design, communications, or finance. Who typically owns this issue?
Right. So I think when you're talking about like grassroots level of work, I think at that level we're talking about, okay, the goal should be to try to build capacity in frontline communities that are most and worst impacted by climate related threats. So I think what that means in terms of actually like doing that is you have to build capacity by engaging those communities. And I think in terms of like how you go about doing that, it requires a robust and very thoughtful community engagement plan and process. At Greenlining, I think one of our strengths is the coalition of organizations and CBOs that we work with to try to advocate for policies we think are creating equitable outcomes. And I think Greenlining, what we do well is to really lean on our coalition because we don't know all the answers. So when there's, so for us, when we're trying to create this kind of engagement to understand what the needs are in local, like at the local level, we often do series of like workshops, town halls, where we organize these meetings and bring everyone into the same room and try to understand if it's a proposal we're trying to work on, try to get feedback on the proposal from state agencies, CBOs, anyone in our coalition. But I think in terms of kind of doing more like implementing programs at the local level, I think you have to think about when you're trying to engage local groups, you have to kind of think about your presence there. And you have to build trust if you're new. So like that in itself takes time and it takes commitment, and you have to show that you're there to stay, that you're not just gonna go and interview folks or get their feedback and then not really show anything for it. And I think in terms of like other equity considerations, when it comes to engaging folks at the local level, it means being considerate of things like language barriers, cultural sensitivity needs. Right now with COVID, where we can't be in the same space, how do we create community engagement opportunities that also like are considerate of those equity considerations? It means having events at times or venues that most people feel welcomed and safe to attend. And I think one example I would provide that you can go and look up is, I think a group that did the community engagement really well is the Oakland Climate Action Coalition. It's a cross-sector collaboration in Oakland where they had a super robust and inclusive community engagement process to figure out what their climate action, climate resilience planning should be. And I attended some of their community meetings. First of all, they had their meetings in places like libraries or community centers, and they had a lot of them. So if there's just more likely that people will be able to make it to the meetings if the times are dispersed. And they had their meetings at the end of the day when people who have to work 9 to 5 could attend it, and they often provided childcare. So just kind of thinking of that, about that when you're creating those kind of community engagement processes. And I think in terms of, another example I can offer is at the Greenlining Institute, since our coalition members are spread across the state, the environmental equity team, what we do is each year we have an annual community tour. So we go down to San Diego, we go down to LA, and we arrange meetings with our partner organizations, a lot of the times local CBOs or state government offices, and try to just kind of have face-to-face time with them to see what they're working on, what their concerns are, maybe areas we can where we can collaborate or get feedback on what we're working on. So those are just like some ideas that come to my mind. But I think in terms of kind of looking at more specific examples, I would definitely recommend taking a look at the operationalizing equity framework on the Greenlining website.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. We are running a little bit behind time, but I did get a private message from someone that is very inspired by both of you. And although this question is a little bit off topic, I was hoping you would be able to quickly answer it. So this individual said that they are not quite in the green field, but they're looking to transition into the green field, meaning this industry. From your experience, do you have any recommendations of particular fields or specialties in the environmental movement that are most needed or that will be booming?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first, Parwana? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love
Yeah.
that question because I mean, like, I'm pretty early on in my career, and the way I ended up where I am is right now. I mean, I studied environmental policy out of my love for like recreating in the outdoors. But in terms, like, once I graduated, I didn't really know what to do with that degree. And so I've done a lot of fellowships. And a fellowship I did was at Grid Alternatives, which is a solar nonprofit. The fellowship allowed me to kind of basically just like be trained and learn about the solar industry. And then that brings me to the point of like your specific question. If you look at kind of stats or predictions of kind of which industries are supposed to experience growth, I would definitely look into like clean tech companies, clean tech solutions, whether that's solar or wind or whatever. I think like solar installer jobs are supposed to grow at an incredible rate in the next, I don't know how many years. But I think there's like great potential for clean technology innovation to really get us and usher us to this next phase of a clean energy future. I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you. Diedre?
Yes. So just briefly, I think that is a great question because of my journey and my experience that you heard, that led me to where I am today. The most important part is networking and having a mentor, finding someone that you really connect with, that can help guide you. You can have conversations with, who's of a like mind, that can kind of help guide your way. And then somehow really the universe just unfolds things in a way where something will come to you that you realize, I can do this kind of work. Like for me, soil is my first love. Draw down solutions for capturing carbon is key, I think, as the future. I think that is where we're going to see great economic boom and a way to really solve a lot of the world's problems, especially on a local level. So yeah, that's my advice.
Thank you so much. For the person that privately messaged me, I hope that is a sufficient answer for you. So this essentially concludes our event. I would like to thank everyone that participated and joined us. Sam is going to be posting a post-event survey link in the chat box. Please fill that out for us so we can continue to improve our virtual events. Tripping on my words right now. Thank you again for Parwana, Diedre, for presenting today. We sincerely appreciate it and learned a lot from you both. Thank you for everyone that submitted your questions. For our keynote speakers, thank you to our interpreters, our sponsor. Last but not least, again, thank you to everyone that joined us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your week. We hope you stay in touch.